Okay, I'm going to get us started. Hello, welcome to Antifascist Histories and Models for Resistance. My name is Julie Carr. I'm a professor of English and the chair of Women and Gender Studies at the University of Colorado in Boulder. I'm here to welcome you and say some thank yous before turning things over to Anna Duensing, who will be moderating tonight's panel. So first of all, thank you to everyone who is attending. We are really excited and grateful that you're here to think through these issues and histories with us. Thank you also to Chad Kautzer and Jenny Weil and Anna Duensing of the April Institute for Anti-Fascist Research and Education. Anna will tell you more about the April Institute in a moment. Thank you to Michaela Cruz, who is working the tech for this event. And thank you to CU Boulder's President's Fund for the Humanities, the Center for the Humanities and the Arts, and the Departments of English, History, and Geography for generous funding for this and future April Institute events, which we will also mention in the chat. And thank you to the Kasdan Institute for the Study of the Jewish Role in American Life for co-sponsoring tonight's panel. I also wanted to especially thank my colleagues at CU Boulder, and there's too many for me to name right now, but they know who they are, and I'm really grateful for the enthusiasm and the support and thoughtful engagement with this project that they've shown me, so I'm grateful, thank you. And with that, I am going to turn things over to tonight's moderator, Anna Duensing.
All right, hello, good evening, good afternoon to all. Thank you so much for joining us, for logging in for our inaugural event. I will say really briefly, I am a historian and currently a postdoctoral fellow at the Carter G. Woodson Institute for African American and African Studies at the University of Virginia, and I'm joining you from Charlottesville this evening. I will be facilitating, as you heard, as well as managing the Q&A, questions from all of you later on. But I did want to take a brief moment, as Julie said, to introduce the April Institute, which is the group behind this event, before introducing you to our wonderful panelists. So the April Institute is a new anti-fascist research and education collective dedicated to educating the public about historical and contemporary fascist and anti-fascist movements in the United States. And we very much benefit from the expertise of professional scholars and institutional academic partnerships. And we will continue to collaborate with historians, political theorists, literary scholars, digital humanists, and many others in our programming and future research. Yet our commitment really is first and foremost to remaining as accessible, unaffiliated, activist-minded, and public-facing as an organization, and we are a registered nonprofit in the state of New York. And our name, the April Institute, is in part a reference to April 1945, which witnessed the deaths of both Hitler and Mussolini, the liberation of several major concentration camps by Allied forces, and the victory of the resistance in northern Italy. It's also a reference to the likely etymology of the word April, which is the Latin verb aperio, which means to open or make visible, and thus aligns with our mission to disclose the past while creating openings for change and renewal. And so you all are taking part in our inaugural event this evening, which is the first in a series of online and in-person colloquia that will run through next spring and summer 2023. We hope these panels will really mark just the beginning of a broad and robust set of events and initiatives, which will grow, we hope, to include digital and physical exhibitions, film and radio documentaries and podcasts, pamphlet and book publications, and much more. I'm sure you're all aware that many public narratives about the history of fascism and anti-fascism in the United States are rather sporadic, they're uneven, they're oftentimes quite distorted. And as such, public understanding of contemporary fascist violence, movements, tendencies, institutions, much of the public's ability to understand this phenomena really lacks the context of their deep and really vivid historical roots. So in turn, those curious about or even actively engaged in anti-fascist resistance are often deprived of the insights gained by a lot of current scholarship, a lot of primary sources, and by this long, complex, continuous, and successful anti-fascist tradition in this country. So in the spirit of transparency, I will say these issues live at the heart of my own research and my own activism, but I really do feel I can speak for my co-organizers when I say that we took up this work in the past few years in recognition and honor of this tradition, which is that of the global anti-fascist left, but in the context of the United States, specifically that of the Black radical tradition, whose great thinkers and writers and artists have argued forcefully for nearly a century that fascism was neither a break nor aberration, nor was it confined cleanly, to the borders of interwar Europe, but rather emerged in the interwar years as the latest iteration of white world rule and as a socio-political movement and form that is continuous with older histories of colonial dispossession and imperial extraction and chattel slavery and capitalist crisis. So again, in recognition of our name, in recognition of April 1945, this isn't a very important turning point, obviously, but our work is dedicated to what lived on after that, what evolved, influenced, and adapted into the post-war world. So with that, I want to thank you all for being here, and we'll introduce our panelists. And I'm introducing them in the order that they're going to offer some remarks. And I will say, we asked each of them to speak to a series of questions in relation to their own research and expertise. The questions were, when, where, and how does the anti-fascist tradition in the United States begin for you? Or rather, what is the story of fascism and anti-fascism in the United States that your research illuminates? Second question, what does anti-fascist resistance look like? What are the aims of the anti-fascists you study? What models do they draw upon, and what models do they provide? And lastly, how does an embrace of the language of anti-fascism change our understanding of US history, the US left, of political radicalism, grassroots organizing, and histories and ongoing realities of political repression, domination, and resistance? So our first speaker will be Mark Bray, who is a historian of human rights, political violence, and politics in modern Europe at Rutgers. He is the author of Antifa, the Anti-Fascist Handbook, the Anarchist Inquisition, Assassins, Activists, and Martyrs in Spain and France, Translating Anarchy, the Anarchism of Occupy Wall Street, and he's also the co-editor of Anarchist Education and the Modern School, a Francisco Ferrer reader. Charisse Burden-Stelly is an associate professor of African American Studies at Wayne State University. She is the co-author with Gerald Horne of W.E.B. Du Bois, A Life in American History, and is the co-editor of two edited collections, Organize, Fight, Win, which actually just came out, Black Communist Women's Political Writings, co-edited with Jody Dean, and another volume, Reproducing Domination on the Caribbean Post-Colonial State, with Perry Hinson and Aaron Kamugisha, which is also just came out this year, about to come out. Burden-Stelly's single-authored book, Black Scare, Red Scare, will be published with University of Chicago Press next year. Last year, she guest edited the Claudia Jones, Foremother of the World Revolution, a special issue of the Journal of Intersectionality. Her writings also appear in peer-reviewed journals, including Small Axe, Souls, Du Bois Review, Socialism and Democracy, International Journal of Africana Studies, and CLR James Journal, as well as public scholarship in Monthly Review, Boston Review, Black Perspectives, and Black Agenda Report. And lastly, Steve Ross is a distinguished professor of history, the Dean's Professor of History, and director of the University of Southern California's Kasdan Institute for the Study of the Jewish Role in American Life. His most recent book, Hitler in Los Angeles, How Jews Foiled Nazi Plots Against Hollywood and America, was named a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize in History for 2018, and has been on the Los Angeles Times bestseller list for 23 weeks. It has also been made into a documentary for French television, which in English was called Leon Lewis, the Man Who Defeated the Nazis in Hollywood. His previous book, Hollywood Left and Right: How Movie Stars Shaped American Politics, received the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences Film Scholars Award and a Pulitzer nomination. Working Class Hollywood, Silent Film, and the Shaping of Class in America won a Theater Library Association Book Award in 1999, as well as a nomination for the Pulitzer and the National Book Award. And his current book, The Secret War Against Hate: American Resistance to White Supremacy After 1945, will soon be published with Bloomsbury Press. So with that, thank you all so much. And Mark, please take it away.
Yeah, thank you for that introduction, Anna. And thank you to everyone who helped organize this event, and to Steve and Charisse for joining me tonight. So my research on anti-fascism is about the notorious Antifa, which of course I'm sure many of you are familiar, is a shorthand for anti-fascism or anti-fascist in a number of languages. And it's also often referred to as the militant anti-fascist tradition in English, or the radical anti-fascist tradition in French, the autonomous anti-fascist tradition in German. And it's a tradition that in a sense goes back as long as there has been anti-fascism, right? There have always been debates about how to confront fascists and Nazis and white supremacists, the degree to which physical confrontation should be part of the repertoire or not. But I think that we can see this specific tradition crystallizing itself as the distinct tradition that led to the Antifa of present day, really coming out of post-war Europe, when there were essentially debates in the left about how to respond to the potential of a resurgence of fascist or Nazi politics. And the dominant answer on the European left after World War II, put forward by socialist and communist parties, was to essentially make it illegal, to pass laws, to use the courts and the state to make it so that it would be illegal for Nazis or fascists to regroup. The militant anti-fascist tradition in this context really starts to define itself particularly in opposition to that view. As you see resurgence of fascists, not always using the term fascist, often not, fascist organizing and violence in the 70s, 80s, and 90s in countries like Italy or Germany or the United Kingdom. A kind of new generation of militant anti-fascists argued that it was not enough to leave it to the police. In fact, they often had anarchist or anti-state or state skeptical politics. That it wasn't you couldn't count on the police to sufficiently stop the rise of the fascist menace, and instead resistance had to come from below. And in that sense, this is sort of a tradition that puts direct action on the repertoire of action, but it isn't the most common tactic. I'll talk about sort of the modus operandi of this tradition in a moment, but it is the format of resistance that gets the most attention. That's certainly the case. In the United States, this specifically European-inspired tradition, right? Here I'm talking about those who took their cue from the European tradition, really gets going with anti-racist action starting in the late 80s into the 90s, which was a network of radical anti-fascist, anti-racist organizers across the US, Canada, and a little bit in Latin America, who organized hundreds of chapters across the country, confronted the KKK, the Heritage Front, World Church of the Creator, all sorts of different white supremacist and fascist organizations, and also did reproductive rights work, defending abortion clinics and so forth, which is, of course, still an issue. And, thinking about what the aims of Antifa groups, what the aims of militant anti-fascist groups have been throughout the past decades, is to understand it, we can just start a little bit with the specific historical context. That starting in the 70s particularly, you have efforts by white supremacists to infiltrate punk and skinhead culture. Skinhead culture was originally not racist. It was the product of cultural exchange between Caribbean immigrants to the United Kingdom and British working class culture. But white supremacists created their own kind of neo-Nazi skinhead movement, which is now, unfortunately, the kind of, when people think of skinheads, right, they think of that. And so in many cases, this militant anti-fascist tradition during this era was a response in music scenes, in neighborhoods, in football stadiums, in immigrant communities, for example, among Turkish immigrants in Germany, for example. A lot of the militant anti-fascists of the 80s and 90s were Turkish immigrants, to push white supremacists and fascists out of their scene, out of their community, to organize in self-defense against this kind of onslaught of violence, which in the German case, for example, was particularly virulent after the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989 and a kind of nationalist euphoria that swept towards reunification. And so if we understand the kind of methods of resistance and the aims of resistance in this context, it's usually geographical based, defending neighborhoods, pushing white supremacists out of neighborhoods, defending music scenes. And in that sense, Antifa is kind of a politics or a strategy of resisting small and medium-sized white supremacist, Nazi, fascist, and far-right groups. It's not always, although it can be sometimes, a politics of mass movement building. There have been instances where militant anti-fascists have fruitfully worked in coalition with larger political parties, unions, NGOs to create broad coalitions. I mean, even thinking about the resistance to the Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville, that was an example where some self-described militant anti-fascists who were part of an Antifa group worked with other kinds of groups and organizations to create a kind of united front, right? But it's not expressly always a kind of mass movement building. It's a kind of militant politics that's designed for small and medium-sized resistance to fascist groups on that level. And so, thinking, for example, to I believe it's the third chapter of my book, I interviewed a lot of European anti-fascists who were talking about how, in the context of the rise of the far right into parliament with big parties in countries like Italy or France, that militant anti-fascism in and of itself didn't have all the answers, right? It could be part of the solution, they argued, but wasn't sufficient on its own to deal with that kind of problem, right? To deal with that kind of problem, other kinds of sectors of society need to be mobilized, and we need a popular anti-fascist resistance. And so, shifting gears a little bit to the United States, which, I am a historian of Europe, so that's my research home base. But shifting the context to looking at the United States, some of the questions posed by the organizers were when anti-fascism starts in the United States. Robert Paxton argued that we can think of perhaps the first proto-fascist group in history anywhere being the KKK. And I think that there's a lot to be said for that in a functional sense we can see, not only with, wearing the uniforms and organizing racist violence and intimidating the Black community and so forth, but in its kind of sense of reaction, right? Fascism is fundamentally about trying to return to an imagined past, right? To make America great again. And so the KKK wanted to do that. And so I think that we can think of fascism insofar as it always has this sense of wanting to return to an imagined past, glory days, really in a kind of proto-fascist sense, perhaps in this era. And in that sense, anti-fascism we can see too as resistance to the Klan, resistance to white supremacy during Reconstruction. And this brings up interesting questions about the relationship between fascism, imperialism, and colonialism. And I agree with Ami Césaire and others who have argued for seeing Nazism and fascism as a kind of colonialism or imperialism brought home to the European continent. And in that sense, of course, there are all sorts of continuities. But I think that, as opposed to the era of slavery, when more or less for slaveholders and supporters of the slavery regime, things were more or less how they wanted it to be, you get this sense of wanting to return with the KKK and subsequent white supremacist organizing. So what story does my research illuminate? Well, the term that's often used for the anti-fascists who traveled to Spain during the Spanish Civil War was premature anti-fascists, because they went there before World War II, which has, of course, become the example of anti-fascist resistance. And because it's such an important example, has essentially, in many cases, negated the possibility that fascists, Nazis continued to exist after World War II, although obviously they did, and therefore to negate the fact that there were people and still are people resisting them after World War II. So I think in that sense, if the anti-fascists of the Spanish Civil War were premature anti-fascists, then perhaps those of the post-war period, in terms of how they're treated by scholarship and the media, are belated anti-fascists, that in a sense there's a significant amount of disbelief that this is still a problem, although of course that's changed over the last few years for obvious reasons. But I think that by researching militant anti-fascism of the 80s, 90s, and subsequently, it reveals that this is a tradition that has a lot of history, and there have been a lot of groups that have been very active. But what's interesting, and this goes back to what I was saying about how militant anti-fascism often is a strategy used against small and medium-sized groups, is that there's a kind of a paradox, or you might say, that when militant anti-fascism is working well, it stops fascist groups before they get big enough for anyone to care that they were stopped, right? So there's a great book coming out next year on PM Press, We Go Where They Go, written by a group of co-authors, some of them former anti-racist action organizers, where they document all these examples throughout the US and Canada of organizing against KKK groups and other groups in small towns, in local communities. And this has not really been the story of why the KKK rose and fell during this era. But I think that people doing research on this tradition are helping to put that story really on the map. Thinking about the role of the language of anti-fascism in American history, I think is interesting, because as I said, there's this little window of time where it's been seen as appropriate, and elsewhere has, in a sense, been seen as inappropriate. But I think that if we bring the term anti-fascism into discussions around the history of the United States, it pushes back against the tendency to see Hitler and Mussolini as something over there, something that was antithetical to American values, whereas, of course, in fact, Hitler got a lot of his inspiration ideas around genocide from looking at the genocide of the indigenous population of the Americas, looking at eugenics, Jim Crow, and so forth and so on. And so it puts those two worlds into conversation in a way that obviously makes sense in a number of ways. And also, I think it challenges the notion that the story ended in 1945, because it is well known, of course, the kind of racist violence that the 1960s and 70s, particularly in American consciousness, witnessed. But thinking of it as, if not necessarily the exact same thing as what we see in Europe, as a kind of fascism, and then, of course, looking into later decades, 80s and 90s, when you have what some scholars and activists have called the Nazification of the Klan, the merging of these two groups, which you can see, for example, with Greensboro in 1979, it puts these two conversations together, and I think pushes us to be more introspective about what the history of the United States means in all of this, and pushes back against the lazy narrative that the US was simply the good guy in all of this, which of course is missing a lot of what happened. And I think that it pushes us to ask more questions about what fascism looks like today in the United States, why it has popular support, how fascists have in some cases been somewhat successful in arguing that their politics reflect the true history of the United States and the true values of the United States. And so I guess I think I've probably been going on for about the amount of time that the organizers want me to go on. So I'm just I'll pull the plug on myself now, and I look forward to chatting more in the Q&A. So I think, Charisse, I think you're up next, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes, I am. Thanks so much, Mark. And I think that much of what you said kind of flows into what I will talk about, specifically that World War II was not the sort of victory over fascism we're often taught it was. And to get at this point, I'm going to draw on thinkers in what I call the tradition of radical Blackness, who are analyzing the fascist-like character or the threat of the rise of fascism in the United States after World War II. And so scholars, organizers, activists, and journalists operating in what I call the tradition of radical Blackness offered an analysis of US society following World War II as fascist, pro-fascist, and/or fascist-like by analyzing the dire situation of Black Americans. So I define radical Blackness as communist, socialist, anti-capitalist, and/or revolutionary analyses of the structural and material conditions of local, national, and global Blackness, and efforts to imagine and bring into being liberating possibilities for all oppressed people. It centers critical political economy analysis, attends to intra-racial class conflict and antagonism, theorizes the international character of Blackness as a special condition of surplus value extraction, and strives for the eradication of capitalist exploitation. Here, racialization is understood to emanate from the capitalist mode of production, in which both Blackness and radicalism become threats to the property relations, labor hierarchies, and forms of accumulation and expropriation that constitute the capitalist world economy. As such, radical Blackness has been variously targeted by US authorities as extremism, authoritarianism, and terrorism to rationalize the use of extraordinary force, violence, and exclusion. And particularly, I want to think with the petition, We Charge Genocide, the historic petition to the United Nations for relief from a crime of the United States government against the Negro people, which was edited by William L. Patterson and the Civil Rights Congress. So thinking with that petition and those who are around it, we can see how the threat of fascism in the United States was conveyed in the aftermath of the Second World War. And that one of its striking features was a spike in violence against Black people. And I think that this is particularly important because part of what these people were arguing was that the increased attack on Black people, which there was a sort of long history of this, but there was an uptick after World War II, is actually what helps to reveal the fascist-like character of the United States. So even as it doesn't look like Italy or Germany or Spain, the US, there's still a threat, an ongoing and endemic threat of fascism in the United States, especially when we look at Black people. And so the charge of genocide was meant to save bourgeois, was not meant to save bourgeois democracy from the capitalist machinations, which would lead to fascism, but rather was, it was a way to raise this sort of genocide as a matter of concern to all who were conscious that the evils of racism were among the foremost fruits of capitalism. As World War II gave way to the Cold War, the United States consolidated its global hegemony with policies and practices that were eerily reminiscent of what they called Hitlerism. In the US case, however, as had been the reality historically, the target was those of African descent. Likewise, the collaboration with the Soviet Union against the Axis powers quickly descended into confrontation. Communism and adjacent forms of radicalism became the primary targets of US foreign and domestic policy. Such anti-radicalism was meant to terrorize African Americans, attenuate the gains made by labor, and to control forms of militancy that after 1945 were construed by all three branches of government as foreign inspired and threatening the stability and security of the United States. As We Charge Genocide argued, the rise of US fascism could be gleaned in the interconnection of genocide against Black people in the United States and US imperial oppression. As such, the curtailment of the former was a key to ending the latter. Additionally, these thinkers in the early Cold War sensed the threat of fascism and the increasingly draconian anti-communist policies adopted by the US government. Domestic subversion was targeted by an anti-radical state apparatus that comprised a network of government organizations, including the State Department and the Federal Bureau of Investigation, and the Department of Justice, as well as congressional committees like the House Committee on Un-American Activities, the Subversive Activities Control Board, and the Senate Internal Security Committee, as well as instrumentalities like the Attorney General's list of subversive organizations and the 1951 FBI Responsibilities Program. And then, of course, there was a cacophony of legislation. I won't go into all of it here, but the main ones were the sort of Smith Act and the Internal Security Act of 1950, as well as the Communist Control Act of 1954. And so all of these entities worked together to construct discourses of un-Americanist subversion and threat to national security. And at the top of the list of those who needed to be rooted out were communists and their sympathizers, which was a broad designation that included anyone who disregarded and criticized the US government's Cold War politics, including peace activists, civil rights leaders, dissident artists, and progressive labor organizers of all types. So what's really important here is that for them, the convergence of anti-communism and anti-Blackness really was the cornerstone of seeing the rise of fascism in the United States after World War II. So US communists and fellow travelers, especially those of African descent and foreign origin, as well as Jewish people, were particularly sensitive to attacks on their freedom of speech, press, and association by the anti-radical state apparatus, which was interpreted as the first step toward fascism on their own shores. The Black Chicago Communist Party leader Claude Lightfoot, for example, noted the negative trifecta that arose after World War II, which was the Cold War, the escalation of a fascist danger at home, and the violent return of the lynch mob. Quote, this nation had not experienced a period like this since the days of the Alien and Sedition laws, end quote. And of particular concern regarding the rise of fascism was a provision of the McCarran Act that would give the president broad authority during a national emergency to take control of all institutions of government and put people in jail without trial. And of course, this aspect of the Internal Security Act of 1950 has actually not been struck down. Just putting it out there. So the Black poet Langston Hughes had similar misgivings about the Smith Act. Regarding the June 20th, 1948 indictment of 11 CPUSA leaders, he noted, quote, first Hitler locked up the communists. The Jews were number two, end quote. And then like other radicals of African descent, Hughes further noted, quote, in America, the Negroes are number two on history's list. If the 12 communists are sent to jail, in a little while, they will send Negroes to jail simply for being Negroes and to concentration camps just for being colored, end quote. From a prison cell in Terre Haute, Indiana, the former New York City councilman and Black communist paragon Benjamin J. Davis Jr. correspondingly argued that impending fascism in the United States was most manifest in the oppression of Black people. He said, quote, toward the end of World War II, the pro-fascist Negro-hating forces, which had been held in check during the war, began to break loose. The first section of the population to feel the rigors of reaction was, of course, the Negro people, end quote. In her article on the right to self-determination for the Negro people in the Black Belt, the communist doyen Claudia Jones took this analysis a step further, contending that anti-Black attacks facilitated by the interests of big business were reminiscent of the post-World War I moment, the time during which US fascism was likewise on the march, only to be interrupted by the Second World War. For Jones, this violence against African Americans was especially concerning because, quote, the main danger of fascism to the world comes from the most colossal imperialist forces, which are concentrated within the United States, end quote. And this was supported by what she called the most reactionary section of monopoly capitalism and the semi-feudal economy of the Black Belt. Instrumental to both was the oppression of Black people and the working class. Additionally, war in the service of imperialism fanned the flames of US fascism. The Black internationalist freedom fighter Paul Robeson, whose finger appeared on the original cover of We Charge Genocide, likewise maintained that impending fascism was manifested in committees like HUAC, which, not unlike European fascists, harassed and punished those who stood for racial justice, peaceful coexistence, and economic redistribution. When called before the committee, he charged, quote, fascist-minded people will not drive me from the United States. I'm here because I'm opposing the neo-fascist cause, which I see arising in these committees, end quote. So what's important to glean from these thinkers is the way that they saw the confluence of imperialism, anti-Black racial oppression, the drive to perpetual war, and then also the sort of uptick in patriarchal imposition, what Claudia Jones called the Triple K, that these were all sort of, the coalescence of these were harbingers of the rise of fascism in the US after World War II. And this is particularly important because there's a lot of pushback about looking at things like settler colonialism and anti-Black racial oppression as harbingers of fascism, because too often we sort of center the European or the white working class as the victims of fascism, such that though the violence against racialized people or indigenous people are seen as exceptional, as opposed to as constitutive of fascism. And so in terms of what the resistance of these people looked like, it was a lot of mass-based organizing in and of itself, or in conjunction with legal challenges, because another aspect of how they identified fascism was through what they call legal lynchings. And so this applied to people like Willie McGee, the Martinsville 7, the Trenton 6, Rosalie Ingram. And so part of what they did was they waged these legal battles, but they also always organized mass-based struggle in order to challenge the structures of domination that were integral to the rise of fascism. They were constantly forming and joining organizations. Many of them would be attacked and would disintegrate because of oppression from the Subversive Activities Control Board and the House Un-American Activities Committees and those entities, but they continued to form these organizations to sustain mass-based organizing. They relied on international solidarity, and in fact, the filing of the We Charge Genocide petition before the United Nations was a means of galvanizing mass action across borders. And then also, again, it's important to see the ways that their analysis linked up peace and anti-war activism, anti-imperialist activism, anti-racist activism, and anti-colonial activism as elements and as essential to the broader struggle against fascism. And so in terms of how the embrace of anti-fascism today, and even the language of fascism to describe the United States today, I must say that I'm a little bit ambivalent because, Mark mentioned Aimé Césaire, and essentially what he says, or to paraphrase him, is that fascism is a term that Euro-Americans often use when they start to be treated like the colonized. And so there's a way that fascism is held up as a sort of apotheosis of oppression and repression, when again, these other forms of domination are like anti-Black racial oppression, like indigenous genocide, are also sort of as bad as what is considered to be fascism and are actually constitutive of that process. And so I'm a little bit, I'm always try to take a critical lens when the rise of fascism as a language, as a way to describe material conditions arises, because of the way that it can marginalize or sort of move away from the sort of longue durée of fascist-like practices. We also have to be mindful of the ways that in the 1930s, the popular front shift to anti-fascism actually resulted in a turn away from questions of Black self-determination and anti-imperialism. So again, any interrogation of fascism and anti-fascist organizing has to keep, I think, hold all of these things together, the anti-racist struggle and the anti-imperialist struggle alongside the anti-fascism struggle, and see these, in fact, as sort of mutually constitutive. On the other hand, the reticence to call the US fascist or fascistic based on a focus on a European enunciation of fascism discounts the different ways that the conjuncture of liberal democracy and monopoly capitalism, along with more warmongering, have tended toward fascist-like practices in the United States. And as Mark mentioned, how Jim Crow and indigenous genocide have so much in common with fascism, precisely because Hitler looked at the United States for some of the policies that he implemented. And so I think that I just encourage us to take a critical lens when we think about fascism and anti-fascism, and how we are employing that analysis and those modes of organizing in the service of overthrowing many structures of domination and many sort of many articulations of domination, and not simply those that affect one group. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Well, I want to take a more historical view, and I want to start with a question by saying, why is it that it has taken really until the last 20 years or so that historians in particular have been writing about the history of American fascism? And I want to point to two, shall we say, two groups to blame. One is my generation of historians, and the second is Tom Brokaw and his book, The Greatest Generation. So let me start there. For those of us who are in graduate school in the early mid-70s, particularly left historians, we're taking a look at the struggle of communism and anti-communism. And many of us were really focusing on why is it that the government has consistently persecuted communists and those on the left. And we didn't really go into the history of fascism and Nazism, I think in part because many of us felt Germany lost the war, Italy, Japan all lost the war, and therefore fascism and Nazism were ultimately no real danger, certainly not after 1945. And so we focused on the history, as I say, of left activity and anti-left activity. And it's only been, I think, in the last 20 years or so that there's been a real turn towards rediscovering that, in fact, there is a longue array of fascism in America. And my own turn to it came in a kind of odd way. I was writing a book called Hollywood Left and Right, and I was looking particularly at one point, Hollywood activism in the 1930s, and I got very interested in the Hollywood Anti-Nazi League. And that led me to go online to see what other information there was. And I found a website from the Cal State University Northridge Special Collections Library called In Our Own Backyard, A History of Fascism and Nazism in Los Angeles in the 30s and 40s. And when I went over there to take a look at, the volumes on the Hollywood Anti-Nazi League, I realized there were too many to look at for what would have been a paragraph or two. And so I thought, I'm going to come back after I'm done with that book and take a look. And I did. And what I discovered was they had over 300 volumes that were a history of anti-Nazi, anti-fascist activity in Los Angeles from the 1930s onward. And to cut to the main point, what I discovered is that as early as Hitler becomes Reichschancellor of Germany in January 1933. And Americans have long asked the question why, and particularly Jews, why didn't Americans and particularly Jews fight back more strongly? Why didn't they oppose Hitler? And what I discovered is they actually did. But there was a very divided strategy in the 30s between the Anti-Defamation League, the American Jewish Committee, the American Jewish Congress, and in particular, the American Jewish Congress, led by Stephen Wise, argued that we needed to get in Hitler's face, and they, along with the non-sectarian Anti-Nazi League, launched an international boycott of all Nazi products until Hitler stopped persecuting all minorities, not just Jews, but all minorities. On the other hand, the American Jewish Committee, led by Judge Proskauer, argued that if you get in Hitler's face, he's just going to double down in persecution of the Jews. And so Jews actually had a strategy. It was just a very divided strategy, and so divided it weakened any common effort. And what I discovered in Los Angeles was a man, Leon Lewis, who was the founding executive secretary of the Anti-Defamation League in 1913, had worked in 1915, was assigned to work with the studio heads in Hollywood to make sure there would be no anti-Semitic images in the films. He moves here in the 1930s. He is watching Hitler's rise to power very carefully because he also headed up the ADL's international division. And in August 1933, he's totally upset that there is no common strategy to oppose Hitler. And when Nazis in LA hold their first meeting in the end of July 1933 and announce they're going to save America from the two greatest threats, Jews and communists. And at the end of that meeting, something like 100, 200 people sign up to join what was then called the Friends of New Germany that became the Bund. Well, here's what I found is the first documented anti-Nazi form of resistance. Leon Lewis, who had served in the war, and was a member of the Disabled American Veterans as well as the American Legion, goes over to Patriotic Hall, which was built by the LA County Supervisors in 1928 to house various patriotic groups. And he goes and he meets with 4 of his friends, all of whom are Christians. And he says, we have to stop Hitler's men in LA right now. And he asked them and their wives to go undercover and join every Nazi and fascist group in Los Angeles and report back to him on what their activities are. And also he wants them to be agent provocateurs. He asks them to rise to positions of power and to try in those positions to subvert Nazism and fascism in LA and across the country. And from 1933 until the end of World War II, he recruits a whole series of spies, all but one of whom are Christian, who in fact join all these groups. And it's a good thing they did, because what do they discover? They discover Nazi plans for destruction of all military installations along the Pacific coast. They discover Nazi plots to take over armories in LA, San Francisco, and San Diego. They discover Nazi plots for sabotage in the LA aircraft industry, which was the largest producer of airplanes in the country. They discover Nazi plots to, in one case, hang 20 of the most prominent Jews in the city, and in another, to take 24 major Hollywood figures, 22 of whom are Jews, and 2 actors known to be too friendly to Jews, Charlie Chaplin and James Cagney, and they are, in the same night, going to blow up all their homes. Well, again, it's a very long story. Lewis manages to foil all these without the help of the police and sheriff's departments, who are in fact part of a number of these Nazi plots. Many of them are members of the American fascist version of Hitler's brown shirts, which are called the silver shirts. They also join in these plots against Jews, Blacks, and minorities. And what I find interesting is when the Charlottesville, the right, when we had the Charlottesville disturbances in 2017, we know that the crowd was chanting, "The Jews won't replace us." But in the pages of the LA Times on Sunday, when they would publish what sermons were being preached, the sermons were being preached were, "Shall we kill the Jews?" In fact, what I discovered is much more anti-Semitism, much more racism in the city than anyone knew. And at one point I thought, this book ends in 1945, and I thought, okay, you know, end of the story in a sense. But it's not at the end of the story, because there's part 2. There's the post-war, and here's where I say Tom Brokaw snookered many of us, not intentionally, but he's an optimist, and he talked about the good war and the greatest generation. And in fact, half of that is true. There were many men and some women who went off to war and discovered in the course of fighting a war and being platoons that had all these diverse people, even if they were segregated by and large. You had Jews, Christians, some Muslims, Buddhists fighting in the army. You had men who never would have met other men during the course of everyday life. And it isn't that suddenly after the end of the war, it was Kumbaya America and everything was wonderful, but there was a sense of appreciation and a sense of a recognition of, quote, the other, whether the other was Catholic, Jew, not really Black yet. For some soldiers, yes, and I found in the Navy, there's testimony from some of the people on ships who said, I am a racist, I'm a Southerner, and I thought that Blacks were the lowest form of life there were, until our boat was attacked by Japanese fighter pilots, and I saw the courageous activities of our Black sailors, and I'll never think of them again in the same way. So we have many of the men who went off to war come back with a new sense of appreciation for difference, and a sense that while I may not want you to marry my sister, you deserve to lead a life free of fear and harm. That the problem is, that was only half the people who went to war. That many of the people who went to war not because they were fighting for democracy against Nazism and fascism, not because they hated Hitler, Mussolini, and Tojo, but simply because Japan bombed us. And when someone attacks you, you fight back. And many of those men went to war. And here's where I want to talk about the longue durée. because what I'm finding is a link between what happened at the end of World War II, and there's a continuity right up to January 6th, 2021. And many of those men who went to war as patriots. And we're talking largely about people from the South and the Southwest. They went to war to defend their country against its enemies. And when they came back, they discovered they had been betrayed by their country, that Congress had passed various legislation that would make it easier for Blacks and Jews to get housing and jobs throughout the country. They expected that when they came back, life would be the same as what was when they left, that Jews and Blacks, who they'd always gotten along with as long as they knew their place, no longer knew their place after the war because they demanded the full rights of citizenship. And we, by the way, we see that after every war, starting with certainly the Civil War. Various minority groups, whether white or Black, are claiming that their service in the military gives them a position of honor as citizens, and therefore they should be treated with equal rights. And what I'm doing right now in my current research is showing how what I call four of the godfathers of white supremacy, Emory Burke, Jesse B. Stoner, James Maydall, and George Lincoln Rockwell, start fighting a war against Blacks and Jews, starting a fascist war after the end of World War II. And they continue to fight it till now. And in fact, many of the people who participated in the January 6th insurrection were the children and grandchildren of those four hate group leaders. And at the same time, what I'm trying to do is document a spy story, because while much of the nation's political apparatus was focused on anti-communism, the American, the American Jewish Committee, the Anti-Defamation League, and a group that no longer exists called the Non-Sectarian Anti-Nazi League were all running spy operations, spying on fascists throughout the country, and trying to bring a halt to both anti-Semitism and racism and white supremacy throughout America. Sometimes they succeeded, sometimes they didn't, but the struggle is still going on. And for anyone who thinks that January 6th was about Donald Trump, of course he was an active part of it, but the people who marched were representing a cause that certainly goes back to 1945, 1946, and in many ways goes back to the Klan, the second Klan of the 1920s, and to the active fascism and anti-Semitism of the 1930s. Let me stop there and open it up.
Yeah, thank you all so much for your time and your really thoughtful and incredibly rich comments. So we do have some really great questions already rolling in, but I did have one of my own, kind of just to get things started, and in the spirit of synthesizing some of your comments. So, you know, I think one of the big kind of perhaps implicit parts of this conversation for us, right, is a kind of post 1945 question, right? And what changes and what stays the same across this so often presumed profound break in 1945. And I think what's really important in the context of the United States, and this is something, you know, you all alluded to, is this question of this rare, honestly incredible moment in US history where there was a kind of patriotic anti-fascism, if you will, right, in the context of the war against Nazi Germany and fascist Italy, and the Axis powers more generally. And there are, I mean, I know there has been around social media relics of some of this surreal era of that patriotic anti-fascism. A really notable example is a government propaganda film called "Don't Be a Sucker," which encourages particularly white Americans to not succumb to racist, anti-Marxist and anti-radical rhetoric. There's another really surreal PSA that came out right after the war featuring Frank Sinatra encouraging young street kids to not harbor hatred against their Jewish neighbors, right? But especially as Dr. Burden-Stelly's comments alluded to, right, that just dissolves rather quickly in the context of the Cold War. And something you all also spoke to right then is this question that fascist movement, fascist-like movements, neo-Nazi organizations, far-right groups of all stripes, there's a trend of them finding power in the state, right? Or believing they carry out or they embody the moral will of the state, right? Or right, feeling like they're seeking to return to some older version of the United States, whether it is the Confederacy, right? Some kind of world of white authoritarian minoritarian rule, right? And then anti-fascists, by contrast, encounter antagonists in the state, right? And encounter repression, harassment, surveillance, deportation at the hands of the state. So what do we make of that legacy in the present moment? If we can think about anti-fascism as this immense grassroots solidarity building force, right, with a kind of sprawling network of possible collaborations, what's the role of local, state, and federal governments in the story when we think about the present moment? In your research, in your analysis of the present moment, I realize that's a really big question. I'll let you marinate with it for a little while. But what do we make of the role of the state in the story in more recent years?
Well, I'll say a few things if no one else wants to jump in right away. Yeah, I mean, the relationship with the state in fascism in general is fascinating because I think there's often a kind of a paradox. And I think you can see it these days, even with just seeing the prevalence of the Punisher logo in far-right symbolism, right? So for those who don't know, right, the Punisher is this comic book character who murders criminals, right? And there's a really good article on Truth Out, if you do Truth Out Punisher, documenting the really like racist and reactionary history of that character. But the reason I bring it up is because you see a lot of uses of the Punisher with the Blue Lives Matter line through it. So you have this, what is on the face of it, this paradox of pro-police sentiment promoting this character who breaks the law to kill criminals. Right now, you know, what this tells me and a lot of other scholars who've written about this is that, on the one hand, the fascist, you know, promotes what they view as law and order, but are usually critical of what they see as the inability of the state to actually do law and order, and what they see as kind of like the kind of bureaucratic, sometimes read as like a effeminate Jewish bureaucrat holding back the real men of society from putting law and order into effect by just simply unleashing violence against the elements of society that are problematic, right? And so in that sense, I think the history of like the relationship between fascism and the state is kind of like that kind of push and pull, and you can see that from the beginning. You know, even in the case of the kind of well, that's getting into too much of side. But what I want to talk about with the United States before I hand it over to the other panelists is it's interesting to see. You know, I'm sure Steve could speak about this in greater length and greater detail, and Charisse as well, based on your U.S. Research. But from what I read, right, by the time that civil rights legislation is passed and you move into the 80s and 90s, a lot of white supremacists increasingly see the United States government as an enemy and not an ally, right? And then you get the Oklahoma City bombing and so forth, and insurrectionary white supremacist violence. And so it seems like, in a sense, the state and local government has been seen as an enemy and an ally, depending on who you talk about, depending on the context, sometimes maybe in certain sense, both. So.
I guess I'll just say part of what, you know, I think it's important to pay attention to the interplay between like the state and local governments and the federal government. So for example, in the We Charge Genocide petition, they talk about the ways that the federal government, in abdicating its responsibility to uphold basically the Constitution in favor of Black people, allows for these genocidal conditions to be enacted against Black people. But the federal government also participates as well. And I think that we kind of see I think that the interplay between the sort of the states' rights issue and the federal government also holds today, because what we see, I think a lot of the sort of right-wing push is happening at the state level, and it's being sustained by the inability of the federal government to curtail like these processes. So we have this, for example, the Anti-Woke Act, all of these attacks on CRT at the sort of state and local level, along with the sort of anti-LGBT and anti-trans legislation that's also part and parcel of this. These sort of these immigrant machinations that are coming out of Texas and Florida, like, which is human trafficking, these immigrant people, that's, you know, what it is, right? And so all of these processes are happening at the state level, and the federal government is rhetorically responding, right? But it's not sort of offering up a counterweight to the state and local processes. And this is and as we know, states' rights has been the sort of the champion or the clarion call of like a Jim Crow and of oppressing all different sorts of minority, not least Black people and workers. And so I think that even this interplay between the state and local level and the federal level allows for the continuity of fascist-like practices, because there's a sort of checks and balances. Even when the federal government is sort of enacting progressive legislation, if you will, the state and local levels can then respond to counteract, and at other times, the federal government and the state and local governments are very much working together. So anyway, I just wanted to throw that out there.
One of the questions that's posted here is, how do we frame anti-fascism positively? And I want to present that in the context of the question about the state. The way to present it positively is that anti-fascism, for much of American history, has been about self-defense, about the self-defense of minority groups in the wake of the inability or reluctance of state authorities to get involved. And I can tell you this, the Jewish groups that I've been looking at, the ADL, the American Jewish Committee, and the Anti-Nazi League, all portray themselves as self-defense organizations, because they are all running spy operations from in the case of the ADL, the 30s on, and the others in the 40s on, during the war. And they are coming under attack from critics like Westbrook Pegler and others as being, he refers to them as the Jewish Gestapo, as Jews who are spying on honest Christians. Well, they're only spying on those who are calling to death to Jews and Blacks. And if you go back to state theory, a government is only valid as long as it can protect the lives of its citizens. And when a government stops being able to protect the lives of its citizens, it is no longer a valid government. And I would argue for many Blacks and Jews in the 30s and 40s and 50s and 60s, that was a serious problem. The police departments couldn't be trusted. The sheriff's departments couldn't be trusted. And folks, it was not a few rotten apples. The barrel was rotten to its core, and it's remained rotten to this day. We can still see it in the LA Sheriff's Department in LA right now. And these groups have simply gone out and organized their own self-defense. And it isn't taking up guns. That isn't what, I mean, the interesting thing about the story I told her in Hitler in LA is this group of Jews and Christians working together bring down the Bund in LA and bring down Nazi plots without ever raising a gun. It is about information, it is about knowledge, and it is about people when they no longer are being protected by the state authorities that are supposed to protect them. They go out and they protect themselves in whatever way they can, and they try to form coalitions with other groups to protect themselves the way they can. And what they understand, and what to me, and again, looking in right now, spy operation from 1945 through the 1980s, so many of the people who are fighting fascists and racists in the country are not Jews and Blacks, they're Christians who are working for Jewish and Black organizations, but never feel they're working for Jews or Blacks. They're working for America, because what they understand is what it means to be a citizen in America. You don't have to love everybody, but when some individual or group calls for death to fellow Americans, it is the obligation of every one of us, whether it was the 30s, 40s, or today, to protect the lives of other Americans, no matter their race, their religion, their gender, their sexuality. And I think that's the lesson of fighting anti-fascism that we have from the 30s on.
Thank you all so much. And that actually kind of transition into the next question I had, which is one that several of our viewers have as well, which is, I guess, a more immediate and you could say urgent question, which is about sort of actual anti-fascist strategy. You all, in your own initial comments and in the figures you study, have alluded to some of them, right? Whether it is deplatforming, whether it is forceful lobbying to the federal government, whether it is infiltration, extensive documenting and exposing, right? What today folks often call doxing, public shaming, right? Or whether it is, seeking alternative forms of justice. In the case of the Civil Rights Congress's We Charge Genocide, right, campaign, right, a petition to the United Nations. So several of our viewers have asked, right, what sort of what can I do type of question. So whether we are talking about kind of grassroots, sort of autonomous, decentralized, very local acts, whether we're talking about something sort of more happening within a formal institution, organized within a community, or something at the state level. What are some of the anti-fascist strategies and tactics beyond those I've mentioned that you see in your archives, that you see in the folks you study, and that you think have resonance today? And yeah, then I'll shift to some other questions.
I mean, I guess I'll just start. Like, every anti-fascist is most effective when they're part of an organization. And I know there's a lot of anti-organization sentiment these days, but they're part of some collective. It's collective action. And whatever that collectivity is, that is the basis of waging a broad-based movement, period. Individual actions are important, but it is the organization or collective container that is the basis of waging a broad-based mass movement. And that has tended to be the most effective. That is what puts pressure on the government, and not only locally or nationally, but also internationally, right? That this is what puts pressure on and what sort of gives exposure to what's happening, is these broad-based movements. And so I just think it's really, collective action is really, really important. Now, whether that is doing very like hyper-localized grassroots work, like some of what's happening in like Denver, Colorado, whether that is doing more sort of national-based consciousness raising or political education, I really think that being part of a collective and joining a collective is really important, especially with the sort of the increasing or intensification of alienation that is a product, I think, of like social media, that is a product of some of our material conditions currently. So I really think like joining an organization or joining a horizontal collective, whatever it is that you want to call it, but joining something is really, really imperative. Because what we know is that the fascists are organized. What we also know is that the fascists, the neo-Nazis, the right wing, they're also internationalists, period. There's a feedback loop between what's happened, the rise of the right wing in Europe and what's happening in the United States, for example. We know this to be true. And so it would be to our detriment to not also collectivize and build a broad-based mass movement.
Steve, you want to go ahead? Or?
Well, I'd actually like to go to a question that was asked about the idea that here are sheriffs and police participating in the insurrection and then going back to being sheriffs and police. And is there any, how do we understand this? And the way we understand it is they're representative of law and order. They are saving America from what they see as an existential threat to the very nature of our civilization. And many of them are coming, and this is why I say there is a link to 1945 with a preaching of white supremacy by the Klan, by groups like the Christian Anti-Jewish Party, the National States' Rights Party, the United White Party, the American Nazi Party. What are these groups all saying? That America is founded on white Christian identity. And in fact, one of the things that I came across in the course of my research that I had not known about, and that is a driving force behind many of these Christian groups, because I kept wondering, how can somebody who call themselves a good Christian also participate in these hate group movements? And part of the answer is there is a sector of Christianity known as Christian identity theology. And that argues that Jews are not, in fact, the chosen people. That Jews are the spawn of Satan and Eve, Satan assuming the form of the serpent. Cain is their child, and Cain goes about killing Abel. And in fact, Jews, it is okay to kill Jews because since they are Satan's spawn, they are going to ultimately live a life or an afterlife in hell. And you might as well get them there a lot quicker. And their point of view about Blacks and minorities, they are mud people. That is, they are less, this is Christian identity theology. They are less than human. They're not even human. You know, the Jews are sort of human, but God's chosen people are in fact the Anglo-Saxons. And they have been the ones who have created our great civilization. And therefore, if you want to maintain a great civilization, as we have seen throughout the history of Western Europe, you've got to contain or eliminate all non-Christian peoples because they pose a danger to democracy, to America, and to patriotism. That's how they can defend themselves and participate in the violence and go back to being authorities of law and order in whatever place they come from.
Before we move on to the next question, I just wanted to just jump back and talk a little bit more about the strategies and tactics. Certainly I echo what Charisse said about the importance of organization. In terms of thinking of tactics, certainly doxing has been really effective in the US. The idea of forcing white supremacists and Nazis and so forth to publicly stand behind what they've been often saying in private is important. And of course, it works insofar as there is a taboo against being a Nazi or an explicit white supremacist. And it works insofar as universities or employers or neighbors aren't going to tolerate it. And so I think that, among other things, it points to how whenever we talk about anti-fascism, if you're talking about anti-fascism as a leftist, then the implication is not only how do you stop the fascists, but how do you build what you're trying to build as a better world. And implicit in that, you know, we see that the latest upsurge in far-right activity is obviously a response to Black freedom struggles. It's a response to queer and trans liberation struggles, you know, and I could name other examples as well. And so that's what I think is profound about the conversation about anti-fascism is you start talking about how do you stop these specific people or how do you change these systems, and you're into the whole conversation around politics. And one other thing that I'm just going to drop in before we move on is that there's from a radical perspective, there's sometimes a potential political danger in how we do anti-fascism if we forget that we're also trying to build, not just destroy, and that we're not necessarily, if you consider yourself a radical person, simply trying to defend the status quo, right, but also change it. And sometimes I think that some of the most insidious results of far-right politics happen when it pushes the left to essentially defend the center. And so I think that there's many complex questions that come up when you talk about these kinds of issues.
Yeah, but I think I agree with both of you, and I think that gets back to the one question: how do we frame anti-fascism positively, right, or as a productive rather than merely defensive force, right? That I think if you immerse yourself in any kind of one of these contemporary organizations or efforts on the ground, or spoke to someone who sort of actively identifies as an anti-fascist, right, much of their work is actually about mutual aid, right, and housing justice and anti-racist struggle within their communities, right, and harm reduction, right, all these other modes, when in fact, like, the street fighting against the fascists is the distraction, right? It's not what they want to be doing. It's rather that building and that world building, right? And community aid is, I think people would say, is their primary goal. Any other thoughts before I shift to
Quick
another
response
question?
to that, Anna, is two things, right? Which I intended to say earlier and I
Mm.
forgot, is that, in the militant anti-fascist repertoire, conflict is a small percentage of what they do, and doxing, information gathering, public education, coalition building, and so forth is more of it. But the other thing that I think is worth chewing over is, if we're thinking about how do we make anti-fascism popular and something that a lot of people like, I think there's sometimes the easy answer that from a radical perspective I would be critical of is to say that the history of America is anti-fascism. World War II is anti-fascism. If you're an American, if you're a patriot, then you're an anti-fascist, end of conversation, and that's it. And I see that that's like sometimes like a political shortcut, but I think that it's important to talk about opposing fascism, not only because it's violent, but because it's misogynist, it's racist, it's imperialist, and thinking of these continuities with American history, that I think that that's a shortcut that has pitfalls to it.
I would suggest that I would go even broader, and I'd say that anti-fascists are the true small d Democrats in America, that they understand that whatever the differences we may have are irrelevant in a sense, as long as we are open to allowing everyone to lead their life free of fear and harm. You can say what you want as long as you're not saying it in a way that projects fear or harm onto other people. And that, in fact, if you believe in the American mission and the democratic mission, and, in my lifetime, I never thought I'd see the fragility of democracy. I never thought I'd see things we've been reading in the New York Times and places for the last several years, that democracy is in jeopardy. Really, democracy is in jeopardy. We're all in trouble if democracy is in jeopardy. And so, to me, anti-fascism is not a left movement. Anti-fascism is right at the core of America. And it bothers me that the left has allowed, and I consider myself part of that, has allowed the right to take over God, country, and the flag, as though that's the only people who are true patriots are those who believe in God, country, and the flag. Like, you can't be a patriot without necessarily believing in God, but you still can believe in your country. You can still believe in a democratic mission. And I think the left has given up both the symbols in many ways and has forgotten that at the core, it's about democracy in America. That's really what the anti-fascist mission is: the restoration of democracy and the opposition of anyone who opposes it.
I just would have to push back a tiny bit on that, just because for the people I think with, right, it's not about the restoration of democracy in America. It's about the realization of democracy in America, which it has not yet beyond, which is an incomplete project, right? Because I would just add that. And the problem with sort of censoring patriotism is the deep link between patriotism and warmongering. And warmongering is sort of foundational to fascism. It's foundational to imperialism. And so I think it's very difficult, the way in the United States, patriotism has been so closely linked to like war making that I'm a little bit hesitant, or I just would problematize that a little bit, as well as this idea that some return to a previous form of democracy in the US is what is desirable, when for Black people, when was that moment? What is that return, right? And So I don't know, and I guess, you know, maybe I'm an ultra leftist or whatever, but I don't know that would be the project of these like sort of Black radical thinkers. I think that they would frame it as a sort of realization of the democratic potential of the United States, which is there, but has probably yet to be realized in its full form.
Well, I stand corrected on that. I think you're right. The realization is a better word for the mass population than the restoration of democracy. But I'll push back to you on patriotism, because patriotism doesn't have to be right-wing conservatism. In the same way, I see the people who went undercover, risked their lives spying on behalf of Jews and Blacks, white Christians, are the true patriots. That, in other words, we can give patriotism a different message. We can push back that patriotism, because it has been. And by and large, patriotism has been used, not just here, throughout the world. Every time there's a war, we send off men and women with great aplomb, and when they come back, they're thrown on the ash heaps of history. But that's one view of patriotism. Why not see patriotism as those who stand up for the ideal of democracy, not one that has been fully realized yet, but one that we hope to realize, that is being a patriot, standing up for a country where all men, all women are equal, regardless of all the things we can add on to that. Again, I think it's a mistake to simply say patriotism is a right-wing term. We can say it's been used by the right, but we need to reappropriate it as part of those who are anti-fascist are the true patriots, not the ones who marched on DC on January 6th.
Yeah, this is a great conversation. And I think the obvious point is that there is a liberal anti-fascist tradition. There is a revolutionary anti-fascist tradition. And there are different stakes involved in what you're trying to promote, what you're trying to accomplish. And I think for radicals, anti-fascism is not simply stopping fascism, but also trying to destroy capitalism. And so, you know, destroy nationalism, right? So there's different projects involved, but you know, we can still stand on the protest line together and yell at the Nazis. So, you know.
But I will say on that note, one of the initial archives that initially really drew me into this work from a historical perspective was just the tenor of Black public discourse in the summer of 1945. Right, kind of speaking to this exact tension. And I read, like, really famously, W.E.B. Du Bois was asked, a Black newspaper, the Chicago Defender, sent him a telegram 2 days after German surrender saying, you know, like, what's your word, right? And he just says right back, well, we've beaten Hitler, but not his ideas. And he's calling for bringing the anti-fascist struggle home, right? And very much right, is highly skeptical of the idea that democracy has been achieved for the world simply because fascist regimes were destroyed abroad. With an eye on the time, I want to get to some of the great questions in our Q&A. So this is one that one viewer put and then someone seconded, and it's on the longer side, but I want to read it in full, which is, I wonder if any of the speakers have practical advice for the civil dialogue sector in light of what could be regarded as a resurgent fascist movement in the United States as one of our major political parties. Like, most civil dialogue organizations see the core problem as one of partisan polarization. So they pit themselves as neutral conveners between those who support democracy and those who are essentially turning against democracy, turning against it, right, adherents of the big lie. This seems wrong to me, that it will only work to spread anti-democratic beliefs, i.e. legitimizing the big lie. Has it ever worked to resist fascism by this sort of accommodation? What advice would you give to civil society organizations that are trying to promote democracy and resist fascism in this nonpartisan way? And I already saw a head shake on behalf of Mark. So is it just a no? The answer is no, it's not.
I mean, since no one's talking, I'll just follow up my no with words. Yeah, I mean, I think that the notion that there can be some sort of accommodation with fascist and far right forces misunderstands their genocidal project. I think that certainly we should be figuring out how to try to talk to people, everyday people who could potentially be sympathetic to fascist ideas, and try to convince them that those are bad ideas and they don't actually solve your problems. But on the kind of macro level, that I'm understanding this question as suggesting that somehow institutionally or structurally there can be sort of an olive branch extended to people who are racist and misogynist and homophobic and so forth, I think misunderstands how power works, and I think implicitly undersells the danger that it poses.
I think, well, so I think that what tends to happen, and I guess this is a question about sort of popular discourse and how fascism is framed by like the media. The media in the US is corporate media, so for whatever that's worth, and to the extent that there's a deep link between fascism and a particular type of monopoly capitalism, there's that. So I'm just gonna bracket that. I think the other thing to say though is that part of what the discussion about fascism in the media does is reduce fascism to Trumpism. And I think that that is wrong-headed, right? And I think it tries to, and it also discusses fascism as something that is episodic, as opposed to something that whose seeds are sort of always already present in this country, right? And then it also tends to not make the connection between the sort of correlation of forces that have also led to the rise of the right wing in Italy, in Denmark, in Great Britain, in the DR, the Democratic or the Dominican Republic, in India. And so the problem with, I think, those discussions is that they're superficial, and what they're actually trying to do, I think, is defend one party against another, or to reduce the sort of the fascist drive to one party, or even to one person, or a sort of small cabal of people within a party, up to and including Nancy Pelosi sort of saying, you know, we just need a better Republican Party, which is strange, right? And so I think that that's one of the huge issues, and why, to agree with Mark, like why that type of discussion is not useful and doesn't actually get at the crux of the matter.
So I want to go to language now, and with the exception of the most extreme fascists, and you can go back to the 30s and find a number of them who openly call themselves fascist. Many of them were then put on trial in 1944 as part of what's known as the Great Sedition Trial. But for most of the American history, fascists have liked to call themselves a more neutral term, nationalists. And I think that's what a lot of people in the Republican Party are calling themselves, that they are nationalists. We're not fascists, we're nationalists, because nationalists sounds patriotic. I think one of the things is to open up a conversation about, what do you believe in? What do you, when we're having a so-called civil dialogue, to ask the other side, what do you believe in? What does nationalism mean to you? What does democracy mean to you? And to really get at some of those terms, because nationalism has been another term appropriated by the right. You don't see the left, liberals or left, referring to themselves as nationalists. And it sounds like a more neutral term, and its history is far from being neutral. So again, the first thing I'd say is, let's look at the language the press is using, and let's call nationalists fascists, which is what they actually are.
So I guess as a follow-up question to this discussion from another participant. So, you know, there has been a change in tone in the media, in mainstream commentators' willingness, right, to sort of slowly edge toward the language of fascism or anti-fascism in their discussions, right? And you can sort of track that chronology from, you know, murmurings in the era of the Tea Party up through the ascendancy of the Trump era, however we want to define that, up through the Summer of Hate and the presence of the Klan and the Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville in the summer of 2017, right, to a really big turning point for people, which I think was the Capitol insurrection. But the question is, right, do you believe it's possible to reclaim the seriousness of discourse about fascism in the context of the mainstream media? And if so, how? And then I would add to that, and if not, where can we forge these conversations? And how do you reach a critical mass and breadth beyond the kind of stranglehold that corporate media might have on most people's access to this information and in terms of shaping the tone of conversations? So just to repeat the original questions, do you believe it's possible to reclaim the seriousness of discourse about fascism and anti-fascism in the mainstream media? And if so, how? And if not, where then?
Well, I think that, like, for example, let's look at how the mainstream media talks about racism, right? If someone doesn't say, hey, I'm a racist, the mainstream media never says that someone's a racist. And I think the base of the same thing goes with fascism. If someone's not like, hey, this is the fascist here, they're not going to talk about them as fascist. They're not going to talk about fascism as a problem. I think generally speaking, I'm sure that, you can find some exceptions here or there. And, it's still worthwhile for those of us who sometimes get interviewed to talk about it, but I don't think that in and of itself is going to be able to accomplish the kind of goal that this question suggests. I don't think that we can count on the mainstream media to talk about fascism and far-right politics, or at least far-right politics under the rubric of fascism. I think far-right's a term that they're much more comfortable with. I'm kind of skeptical on that, and that's why I think conversations like this are great. In academia, certainly the conversation is more lively. In social movements, the conversation is much more lively. I think everyday people are more comfortable talking about, like, hey, like, is Trump a fascist? Like, that conversation is something that I think, at least among critics of Trump, is a conversation that can be had even with people who I think, 10 years ago would have been very reluctant to have it. So I think that it's happening almost everywhere else, but in those platforms.
I mean, I guess the question is, so like, I'm also looking at this question in the chat. I just tend to believe it's less, the language is less important than, like, what are people doing, right? And that indeed, and in fact, having particular types of language is important to the extent that it galvanizes or mobilizes people to a certain end. And so whether, I just don't know if calling them fascists or right-wingers or whatever, I don't know if using that term is, or getting the mainstream media to use that term is what is the most important. So for example, there was a huge to-do about Biden during the 2020 campaign using the term white supremacy, that was supposed to mean something. What happens with the problem with a lot of the United States and the weakness of any type of non-moderate or right-wing politics is that the means become the end, right? That instead of using the term fascism becoming a means to actually analyze and interrogate where we are, the use of the term fascism itself becomes the victory. And so I don't actually care what the mainstream media calls it. I care about, like, what is the content of the analysis, and then what is that illuminating for people, right? That to me is the more salient question. And also what was pointed out is that the use of fascism and of these different terms are actually being used much more on the ground and are being used in even in academia, again, sometimes in reactionary ways, again, to only in reference to Trump, right? But in some ways, I feel like by the time we'll be debating by the time the liberals or whatever the dominant media begins to use the term fascism, it might be too late. That can't be the political goal.
Yeah, I'm not sure what the answer is, but language does matter. And the problem is, I think we've seen since Trump took office, anytime you throw out the term fascist, it gets people's backs up. It ends a conversation rather than begins a conversation. And I'm not sure how we get around that. I got interviewed a lot of times, and the question at the beginning, is Donald Trump a fascist? And my answer is, I can't say he's a fascist, but if he walks like one, talks like one, surrounds himself with them, then there's a good chance that he is a fascist. But rather than use those words, what does he stand for? What are the kind of ideas? I mean, that I would want to go beyond the labels and simply say, what do you mean by this? Whether it's Trump, Republicans, or anti-fascists, what do you mean by these words? What does it mean in terms of action and policy? Go beyond rhetoric. But I don't know if you're ever going to get that in the mainstream media. It's not what they're about.
Just to quickly add, I just don't want us to forget how the New York Times in the 1920s, when they were writing about fascism, it was positive. They loved Mussolini. There was a segment of the media and of the sort of middle and ruling class that really loved Mussolini. So it's not as if so there is a time when this term was used, right? And there is a reason why I think, and not to make a transhistorical argument, but it's just I think that we sort of have to be serious about the Washington Post and the New York Times and MSNBC and CNN and what those politics actually are.
Any other, and I will say, if folks are interested, I put a really excellent book in the chat that really plumbs the depths of exactly what Dr. Burden-Stelly was talking about, really at the kind of highest tiers of American industry and business and print media in the interwar period. And similarly, if folks are interested in more of a public opinion perspective, the Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C. several years ago had a great exhibit called Americans in the Holocaust, which really gets into the depths of a kind of ambivalence amongst the kind of white-led American mainstream about the escalation of anti-Semitic violence in the German state in the 30s. So two great resources there. The next question I have from another viewer, which kind of speaks to some notes I put down, right, which is perhaps ultimately a question about how to stay optimistic in a way. There's been a theme in this conversation with regard to the longue durée of the US right, the constant or frequent collapse of a notion of a mainstream right and far right, the kind of bystanderism or difference then of lawmakers across the political spectrum to shore up an effective response, right? The question in the chat then is, how does the widespread proliferation of guns in the United States factor into the fight against fascism? So I'll let our contributors take that one out.
Okay, I'll talk about guns. Yeah, I mean, in my interviews, I spoke with a lot of European anti-fascists from countries where there just aren't so many guns. And they were very glad that there weren't a lot of guns in their countries, because they said that the anti-fascist struggle would have been a lot more deadly and bloody. And they were, in that sense, they sort of looked at the context of the United States with a bit of horror. That was less true in parts of Eastern Europe when there is more gun violence associated with this. There have been anti-fascist groups in the US, some calling themselves anti-fascist, some not, coming from different traditions that have armed themselves. Some of them have showed up at demonstrations holding the guns as a show of force. It hasn't really resulted in anything resembling gun battles. There is a lot of interesting debate and conversation about how to orient anti-fascist resistance to far-right militias and lone wolf attackers and so forth. And I'm not personally particularly knowledgeable about the ins and outs of that. But it is something to be grappled with because certainly the right has a lot more guns than the left, and they are really eager to use them. So, I think going back to the conversation around self-defense is legitimate, and it's understandable that some groups and some individuals will see that as a reluctant necessity given that context.
Well, to the extent that there is a widespread that guns are ubiquitous in this country, anybody fighting fascism would be a fool to give up gun rights at this moment. Like, to the extent, until we have a sort of, until that is no longer the case, I don't think disarming ourselves is the solution, pending, revolution.
And in that spirit, I just dropped a book recommendation in the chat from the noted Black revolutionary activist and thinker Robert F. Williams, and a very early and important call of Black armed self-defense against the Klan in North Carolina. I'm conscious of the time and conscious of the hour more generally, and I'm wondering if folks have any parting words, any last thoughts before we say our goodbyes. Any last things y'all want to add? Questions you want to leave our viewers with before we start to wrap it up?
Well, I saw a question about Rachel Maddow's series, and I want to recommend it. It was dropped last Monday, the first 2 episodes. I believe it's going to be 8 parts. Every Monday, there's an episode being dropped. It's on MS. You can get it online, MSNBC. It's a podcast called Ultra, which is a terrible title, but it stands for Ultra Nationalists. And she's taking us from the 1930s to the present. And it's a good deep dive into the history of fascism and a little bit on anti-fascist struggles as well from the 30s to today.
So I just would say it's not enough to be anti-fascist, right? You have to be anti-imperialist. You have to be anti-racist. In my perspective, you have to be anti-capitalist, and explicitly so, period, right? And it's not to say that anti-fascist, that these things are mutually exclusive. Obviously, they're not. But I think being emphatic in stating all of those things and the integral link between them is really important. And a part of what's been discussed already is that you can't just be anti-something. You have to stand for something, right? Whether you are for socialism or communism or anarchism or whatever, like, you have to be for something, even humanism, I don't know, whatever you want to call it, right? Peace. So for me, it's peace. To me, peace brings together every single aspect of like my politics, right? Not peace as the absence of conflict or like the kumbaya peace, but peace as the sort of basis by which all of the, the realization of a better world. So, and join an organization or collective, whatever you want to call it.
I'll second Charisse's comments and also say that, just going back to my research, that I think regardless of how people go about engaging with fascism and the far right, that there's like 3 kind of lessons, takeaways from the historical subjects that I've studied that I want to kind of put out there to think about, that I think can kind of transcend some of the debates that people get into, that we could hopefully kind of get on the same page about. And one is the importance of counter-protesting the far right, that not letting them just sort of have the stage and do their own thing. That can take a number of different forms. But I think the old notion of just ignore them, it never made sense, and it doesn't make sense now. Second, the notion of no platform for fascism / similar kinds of discourses, that the goal is not to debate people who don't even believe in rationality and reasonable discourse and want to dehumanize the majority of the planet's inhabitants. And third is the legitimacy of self-defense, which can take different forms in different contexts. But fascist and far right politics, usually challenges, attacks marginalized people who don't often have the support of the majority population, and they need to take up different forms of defending themselves. And I think it's incumbent upon us to recognize that and legitimate that necessity.
Thank you all so much for all your time and all your insights tonight. And for those still with us, thanks so much for logging in. I will say a lot of folks in the Q&A did have the question, why now? And just based on our discussion, that felt a little too big to bring into this moment. But I will say why now really is going to be a central theme of our next event, which is another colloquia addressing these questions, but more specifically about the origins, manifestations, and longue durée of an American fascist tradition. So mark your calendars, November 11th. And once again, thanks so much to our panelists for everything. We so appreciate it. All right, take care, everybody. Have a good night.